Sean, good to be with you again. Sorry.
Hello, Johannes. Thanks for having me again.
Pleasure. Okay. So we are going to discuss and introduce your course on the dynamics of power one last time, because know everyone that this Sunday, Sean's course begins and he will give us again an overview over the thinkers that you will be reading and also the overall project and aim and theme of the course, which I think can be summarized as considering power in a non-ideological fashion. Bit of a mouthful, but I think that is fair to your project. If you have questions for Sean, please put them in the chat and we'll get to them at the end. We've also received a couple of questions from you via email, so I'll get to those in a bit. Maybe you could perhaps present your vision and idea for the overall course, what brought you to the topic, what made you choose the thinkers before you go into specifics that you chose. And after that, I'll have a question for you regarding the practical side of how you'll teach the course.
Yes, thank you. As you said very correctly, I am approaching the topic of power from a non-ideological angle, or at least you could call it something like a post-ideological angle without overusing the word post too much. A post-ideological angle.
Wow.
No. So essentially, what we have, and that's something I speak about on my channel as well, is a kind of hall of mirrors where each ideology claims to have identified power and identified the way to grab it and defeat it and fight it or maintain it or whatever. But what they do is essentially just always give a very narrow perspective. It's almost like looking at a scenery through a keyhole and then just kind of assuming you've understood the entire scenery, the entire image. And essentially, what I'm doing is looking at it from a more holistic, fundamental perspective, and then looking at how these perspectives, how the fundamental perspective is at the root of the various ideological systems that arise in our society. And that is essentially the progression that I'm taking throughout the course from a more fundamental historical angle, beginning, of course, with the ancients, with Aristotle, Plato, and then moving on to a more reductionist systemic theory of power as we get into Luhmann and Foucault, and then kind of bringing it all back together, tying it together, and also tying it in general into the topic of techniques, which is also an important topic in my research on my channel as well, and bringing it all back into a more elementary understanding of power that we really lack when we look at conventional studies of power. A lot of them end up taking a particular angle, a particular for example, a Marxist angle or some other kind of economic angle that only focuses on one particular network. And we have so many different writers and so many different thinkers that take a much broader approach. Even someone like William Domhoff, that I'll be mentioning on the side throughout the course, but he'll be relevant. He even speaks of four networks that are interwoven, that influence each other, says that economic power is only one of the four networks. Obviously, I would say that it's not an exhaustive number. It's not something you can limit to only four. But speaking of four and their interrelationship is still broader than only focusing on economic power, for example. And yeah.
Great. Just for anyone who's watching this on Twitter, it's a good idea to come over to YouTube. So if there are any questions for Sean, we already have one from Nicholas. We'll get to that one when we discuss Foucault. And if you have any questions for Sean, let us know in the chat. Now, one question that we received by email is just on the practical side of how you'll conduct the course. So obviously there are the seminars, the live seminars, if you have time for those, they begin this Sunday, the 9th of June at 6 p.m. UK time. That's 1 p.m. Eastern Standard Time, and you are conducting the seminars. You've developed the course. You're teaching the seminars. I'm not present. And what should participants expect from the seminars? How will you conduct them?
Well, generally, I'm a big advocate of developing the capability of formulating your arguments and basically studying a topic and then being able to argue for or against it. So what we'll be doing, it'll be structured with joint sessions that are then split up into breakout sessions with various smaller breakout groups, and then reconvening afterwards. Depending on the setup, we'll have multiple breakout sessions. And in those sessions, various groups will prepare their arguments, will develop their arguments, and bring forward a fruitful debate that allows us to get deeper, a dialogue that allows us to get deeper into the intricacies of these topics, where the weaknesses of each argument are explored, and you get into the truth or the essence of the matter through dialogue, through dialectic, generally a method that is not only fruitful, but also in a sense mirrors the kind of historical dialectic of power we're going to speak of when studying the topic itself.
Excellent. So feel free to summarize the course, the 5 lectures, and the thinkers that come with each lecture.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah, I would definitely recommend everyone to join the live sessions on the weekends. There's something more immersive about immediately engaging with the topics, immediately having your arguments confronted, rebutted in dialogue, synthesized with others. That leads to a learning process that you can't get by other means. And we will dive right into this Sunday. We'll dive right into the ancients, right into looking at Plato, Aristotle, specifically the fundamental principles we take from them. Obviously, their works are massive and you could study them your whole life. We will be focusing specifically on the forms of government they will be speaking about. So the core 3 principles are going to be the core forms of government. We have famously the rule of one. We've got monarchy in its benign form, and in its lower form we've got tyranny. The difference being that the one in charge, the one ruling in the benign form, is ruling for the entire polis, for the entirety of the society, whereas in the lower form, in the tyranny, you have the one ruling for his own interests, for their own interests, at the detriment of the larger society. And that is the pattern that goes through the various forms of government. They're more benign in their lower forms. For example, if you move on from the rule of one to the rule of the few, you've got the benign form being aristocracy, a minority ruling in the interest of the whole society, a nobility that follows noble principles, that follows principles that are good and contribute to the flourishing of the society, the community as a whole. And you've got the lower form being oligarchy, which we are more we are more accustomed to in our age to speak about oligarchs and more familiar with the term oligarchy, where we speak of an elite that acts not in the interests of the whole society, but in their own self-interest, and often at the detriment of other oligarchs, basically contributing to a disintegration. And then you've got the rule of the many, lastly, which we in a benign way, or Aristotle in a benign way, would call a constitution. We also model our states to be democracies, but also constitutional democracies. And in Plato, you don't find a benign form of democracy. Democracy would be considered purely lower, purely bad in Plato's terms. But you have, in Aristotle terms, the lower form being democracy, essentially. The lower form being the rule of the mob, the masses revolting against potentially an oligarchy, but revolting not based on a sense of a higher good, but merely based on universal plunder, basically of jealousy of the oligarchy, that they get to plunder and the people don't, and so the people engage and expand the plunder, expand the ruling class until the society cannot sustain that size of a ruling class anymore. And you have full disintegration into anarchy, which, interestingly enough, is almost like a twin brother of tyranny, especially when you look at the cycles of civilization, the cycles of government that Plato describes. So essentially, if you look at it, a pure anarchy, a state of anarchy is indistinguishable of a state of tyranny, because you have the rule of arbitrary violence. If you think about it, if you had no rule, no law, in the sense that everyone is basically exerting their power for their self, then you will essentially at some point have a takeover of the most dominant, the most apt at violence, and thus establishing nothing other than a tyranny, right? And that is something that is crucial to understand, because we have the essential categories, so to say, for forms of government, for the polis, namely the rule of one, the rule of few, the rule of many. These are archetypes, you could call them, or historical patterns that you can recognize and that you can attribute to any society, regardless of their cultural contents, regardless of the context of their traditions, of their technology. This is applicable throughout history, and it is just another testament to the relevance and the depth of some of those ancient thinkers, and how, in a lot of ways, we are kind of taking their themes and modernizing them, and adding aspects that are unique to our age or unique to our cultures, but we keep the fundamental principles that they have already spoken of. And what we will look at fundamentally in this first part is exactly how these benign and the lower forms relate to each other, and how they historically transition from one into the other. So, also, why this is called the dynamics of power is because Plato is essentially making a dynamical argument about history. I like to speak. There's this kind of you could call it like a nerd field called cleodynamics that tries to make dynamical study, dynamical arguments about history. Questionable how good cleodynamics is at doing it, but it's almost like Plato was the original and maybe the best cleodynamics expert in a sense. So, moving on from the first lecture, we get into sovereignty, and we get into the principles of sovereignty, specifically looking at Bertrand de Jouvenel and Carl Schmitt.
Yeah, I'll just show very briefly what this looks like when people enroll. So this is inside the course, what you see now on the screen. This is the second lecture, which is
a resistance to this sovereignty is amoral and sinful.
So there's the video, there's the
hello and welcome
audio file, and here's the handout, and also some other files. Before you continue, here's a question from Dawson that I think might be a good segue into this. Do you think? Have you seen it?
Sure.
What is your view on Hobbes and the conception of the Leviathan rule as a remedy to cure anarchy, arbitrary violence, and civil war? Bellum omnum contra omnes, the war of all against all, and the state of nature, of which Hobbes warns.
Yeah. I I tend to try and find a balance between these extreme positions, in a sense, where you've got Hobbes on the one side and you get Rousseau on the other side, where one claims, this natural state is a state of anarchy, all against all, and Rousseau preaches the like noble savage, and all of the oppression and war has come later with civilization. I like to keep a balance between these positions. I would say that certainly there is a very real aspect to what Hobbes speaks about, specifically looking at history, and that is the justification of power, and that's what we're getting at in the second lecture, which is why it is a good segue, namely the justification through a notion of sovereignty. And Hobbes is interesting because of his historical relevance, as Hobbes comes just after the old paradigm of sovereignty, namely divine sovereignty, or political theology, so to say, divine sovereignty, and the new paradigm, which is popular sovereignty. And what we see in a lot of instances is that between divine sovereignty and popular sovereignty, you had absolutism, you had the absolute monarch. And in this limbo, which didn't last very long in a general comparison of history, in this limbo of pure absolutism, the justification of power became Hobbesian in a sense. It was no longer based on that God ordained someone with power. It wasn't yet the popular sovereignty of power. It at that point kind of crystallized into its raw form of I rule because I rule, and into its tautological form, you could say. It's like it's almost this like basic notion of like bigger stick, better argument. It's like you're the one who can overpower me in a very literal sense is ruling over me. And and another point, like often because people focus on this, and I mentioned that in the last live stream as well, people focus on this opposition between Hobbes and Rousseau, for example, or maybe Hobbes and Locke. He's mischaracterized as belonging to the advocates of divine sovereignty. But I mentioned last time that Locke's treatise on freedom, on liberty, was actually a response to Robert Filmer, who came before Hobbes, or around the same time, slightly before, who advocated for divine sovereignty. So you kind of, if you want to have the whole genealogy, you start Robert Filmer, move on to Hobbes, and then move on to Locke to go from divine sovereignty and move on slowly into popular sovereignty, and see really the debates and the development of thought that led from one to the other, represented in these thinkers very well. But we will be focusing on de Jouvenel, who is also a historian, a philosophical historian that describes all of these developments, due to his heritage, also more focused on France, but he goes across, he looks at various revolutions. He also does look at the Glorious Revolution in Britain, he looks at the French Revolution, and he also looks at the October Revolution in Russia, and uses them as examples, as showcases how a transition of sovereignty had happened. But although that transition of sovereignty propagated something akin to a dissolution of arbitrary power, it actually led to an increase of state power. It led to a growth, a proliferation of the mechanisms of power that the state had at its disposal. Right. And what we'll be looking at is the principles of sovereignty as Schmitt describes them, especially Schmitt's famous principle declaring that the sovereign is he who decides over the exception. So it's the famous, rules for thee, but not for me. Whoever is subject to a certain body of law. The body of law becoming more relevant as time goes on, but even during divine sovereignty, the divine sovereignty kind of emerged within a religious context that was very focused on a written tradition of a body of law, whether it ancient Torah, Talmudic traditions, or biblical traditions, or even traditions in the Caliphate with the Quran, all focused a lot on a body of law. And yet, even in a caliphate, the caliph or the sultan often overrides many of these laws with his decisions. The king, the emperor, overrides the laws with his decisions. And if he doesn't, if he cannot, then potentially he's not actually really the sovereign. Great example would be something like these symbolical representational monarchies we have today. Formally, if you look at the law, if you look on paper, you will have a lot of special privileges written in them for monarchs, such as King Charles in Britain has vast authorities. Yet, if you look specifically, most of them haven't been used since the late 17th century. And once they aren't used for such a long period of time, they kind of disappear. So this overruling of the body of law, he could try it. There's a good chance the parliament may just abolish the monarchy, or may just put in restrictions or whatever, just remove more privileges from away from the monarchy, right?
Mhm.
So another important principle that Schmitt focuses on is the distinction of friend and enemy.
Yeah.
That is the most important distinction when it comes to political theory, and that is also intimately related to the notion of sovereignty, to the notion of political formulas that justify your power. As I just mentioned, power that isn't exerted ends. It doesn't effectively exist anymore. And the justification for the exertion of power, pretty often, if not consistently, corresponds or correlates with the identification of an enemy, with the identification of a threat. And especially with the rise of modern mass media, that threat may even be entirely made up. It may even be entirely fictitious. The main point is that the power needs to be justified as the power is fighting a real enemy, a real threat, or protecting you from a real enemy and a real threat.
Yeah, just briefly, there's a great film called The Village from 2004 by, I'm afraid I can't really pronounce his last name, M. Night Shyamalan. Also made The Sixth Sense. I don't know if you know the film, maybe not. But it is about a village, and I won't spoil the whole of it, but they must assume there's an enemy outside or hiding in the forest. That could also be good for anyone who's enrolling in the course to watch that film in preparation or while you're reading these texts. Go on.
Great recommendation. I haven't seen it myself. I'll have a look. All right. Yeah. So, why it is important to look at these principles of sovereignty, look at the state of exception and the friend enemy distinction, is that is essentially the historical motor. Again, we're back at the dynamics of power. It is the historical motor that drives power, but also revolutions of power, changes in power.
Mm.
And that is the core aspect of the Jouvenel's message, and that is the so-called mysterious continued essence of power that changes its appearance, but there is a continued essence of power that
Mm-hmm.
continues regardless of whether a particular regime or particular elite changes. But the change, the motor that drives the change, that essence of power, is constituted by, on the one hand, the sovereign ruling over the exception,
Yeah.
and by the other hand, the friend and enemy distinction as it is propagated in the notion of sovereignty. And that friend enemy distinction leads to the exertion of power that is continuously engaged in its most prominent business, as de Jouvenel calls it, namely warfare, external, internal warfare, a battle against that identified political enemy. And once that enemy is defeated, ironically, power often abolishes itself. The enemy
Mhm.
was necessary for the justification of power, which is often why they invent an enemy, because that enemy can be controlled. It can be kept alive for as long as, or maybe potentially for longer.
Or woken up again if needed.
Yeah, exactly. And that is the motor that drives it. And you can see it in notions such as absolutism, that once the internal enemy, for example, that uh, potentially was the church in certain
Yeah.
areas, was defeated, so to say. Reformation was established. The monarchy was the definite sovereign ruler over the church. You suddenly had, it didn't take long until that monarchy started cracking, and you ended up transitioning into something else, namely into the regimes that came up with popular
Yeah.
sovereignty.
We should point out that, of course, we're talking purely about the past and foreign regimes. We would never assume that this is the case in the political West. Um, of course not. And I would also just want to point out that if you have questions, we've already got several here. We'll get to Nicholas' question when we get to Foucault. We get to Susan, to your question when we get to Jacques Ellul. That's when it makes most sense.
Exactly. Yeah.
Yeah, and if you have any questions now, so Dawson's question made sense now, so we asked it now. If you have any questions for Sean now, please raise them in the chat. Let me just perhaps now briefly point out which different study options you can choose from. You could either, if you don't have time for the seminars, just get the asynchronous study, which is 5 exclusive lectures. I can show you the lectures again, the handouts, and also reading materials, etc., all included here. If you have time for the seminars, that's 6 seminars in totals, 5 lectures, but 6 seminars, because at the final seminar, you will get to present your own work. Could be an essay, a poem, an academic piece of writing. Sean will be able to assist you with that also. And if you really are really deeply interested in power, you could book additional private tutorials with Sean, 6 in total. You'll meet online for 60 to 90 minutes with Sean. Maybe you're working on something politically interested, etc., and you think that you could benefit from discussing this with Sean, then this is for you. You just click on, let's say, philosophical fellowship, and then click on enroll now, and it takes you to the checkout page. You could also just choose 2 payments. So there's a payment plan for the seminars. Now, I do have a question from that I received by email yesterday, which I think might fit now, because you mentioned talking about pure power or the essence of power. Why, someone asked, why is Nietzsche not part of the course?
That's a good question. So Nietzsche features partially, you could say. We spoke about it last time when reading de Jouvenel. De Jouvenel
Yeah.
speaks of various theories of power, and he identifies kind of 2 broad ones. One is focusing on sovereignty, and the other one are so-called organic theories of power.
Yeah.
And in a sense, these are these theories that are, you could say, more heavily focused on metaphysics, more heavily focused on a kind of perspective on the world and nature, a perspective on every living being engaging in a will to power, in a will to be itself, become itself, assert itself, so to say.
Mhm.
And in that sense, Nietzsche plays, of course, into that notion. However, we will be focusing more on the historical, societal, and general structures of power
Yeah.
as we are going from Plato through the topics of sovereignty and social systems as a whole, especially in relation to technology. Obviously, Nietzsche is very relevant when it comes to power in general, and I'd love to make a 10 lecture course and include Nietzsche. But yeah, he will be touched upon, but not central in the course, because he's outside of the focus of the specifics we were talking about throughout the lectures here.
Yeah, and can I just say, obviously, if you've done a lot of reading on Nietzsche, and it makes sense in the discussion to bring, say, Nietzsche up, or to bring up Thomas Hobbes, etc., then that will be part of the discussion. So there's no, just because the main thinker is, let's say, Plato or de Jouvenel, doesn't mean that you shouldn't mention other thinkers. They can become part of the group discussion.
Yeah, for
Now
sure.
here's a question that you can answer briefly, which, because it's similar. Will theories of servitude by Spinoza and de Boïtier, I don't know how to pronounce it, be included?
That's a quick answer. No, they won't be. However, it's always a learning process for me. I learn a lot from these courses as well. So I'm very much happy, and you're very much welcome to bring in different perspectives, bring in perspectives that you've read about. Obviously, everyone has their own preferences in what they read and what they get into, and I'm happy to have them shared and contribute to the discussions in the seminars.
Excellent. So feel free to continue with your summary.
Yes. As Dawson points out now, like Spinoza, Nietzsche, and Schopenhauer would be its own 10-week project minimum.
Schopenhauer is, just to go through the Willis world and representation, is 20 weeks if you want to read all of it.
Yeah, probably. Yes. So moving on, I'm going to focus in the third lecture on propaganda. We've spoken about that as well. Propaganda from the lens of Edward Bernays, and also from the amazing documentary by Adam Curtis titled The Century of the Self. They really go together very well. In general, this course is structured with like teams of authors we'll read that go together very well, that really are fruitful when they're brought together, and that I haven't seen brought together in such a way otherwise. And yeah, this will be the only material for the course. There'll be a film, a documentary series, and there will be focusing essentially on the principles of propaganda and its relevance, and that we cannot leave that out in our modern age, because a lot of power, a lot of the exertion of power is entirely managed through mass media control, and mass media control is maintained through propaganda. So the principles that Bernays speaks about are very straightforward. So we've got, first of all, essentially that public opinion is something that needs to be managed, specifically in democracies. And what is crucial to understand here is that public opinion without it being managed doesn't exist. Like before democracy, before a democratic age, before the printing press, before the mass media, and the simultaneous emergence of propaganda, you couldn't really speak of such a thing as public opinion. There was no relevance or involvement of the public in political matters or political decisions. The public wasn't a relevant factor for policy in the first place. Even the political structures before the modern age weren't designed or weren't set up to enforce such a thing as a public policy. So essentially, public opinion is something that needs to be managed, is a principle we can learn stuff from, but if we really understand it, it is a tautology almost. It doesn't say much, because public opinion is by definition, by its very nature, something that is managed. And why that is the case is simple to understand, because if it wasn't managed, if public opinion was something that anyone with a sufficient degree of free time, sufficient degree of education could just appropriate and assume in any kind of direction, we'd probably approach something in the direction of Hobbes' state of all against all. At least you'd have a uncontrolled proliferation of all kinds of ideologies that essentially are totalizing. That's what ideologies are. They are essentially scientific totalizing or quasi or pseudoscientific totalizing theories about how to manage a state, some of which are in such radical contrast with one another, though being similar in their methods and actual outcomes, that it leads to a severe disintegration. Or you could say that the natural state of such a democracy would be something akin to a perpetual cold civil war. And in order to limit this, in order to allow such a system to prevail whilst maintaining a kind of civil order, whilst maintaining a civil stability, you need a management of public opinion and a management and a redirection, so to say, a channeling into a kind of conflict about public policy that doesn't escalate into kind of, societal sclerosis, demosclerosis of perpetual proto-civil war. Instead, you have a kind of lively debate, as Chomsky would call it, a lively debate within a spectrum that is permitted, that is managed, and thus can allow for and sustain a kind of societal stability. And that is crucial for any kind of democratic state where public opinion has any kind of relevant impact. So another point is, and I've seen a question somewhere as well that spoke about elite theory, that this management essentially is done by an elite of experts and administrators. That elite has been described by various theorists, various elite theorists. You famously have James Burnham with the managerial revolution, the managerial, administrative, managerial class. But essentially, an elite of experts, an elite of technocrats that maintain this management of the public opinion. And what is interesting as well, that this shadowy force that Bernays speaks of isn't necessarily aware of itself. So even the members of this elite class, even they don't necessarily know that they are part of it or that they're part of such a thing. And Yet they engage in it. It's set up in a way that they engage in it, they maintain it, they sustain it, and they advocate for it. Essentially, when people advocate for democratic principles, they advocate for a kind of management, a particular idea and sense of management of a society, an economy, a state that goes according to certain fundamental principles that need to be maintained and respected. That is essentially also the idea behind having such a thing as a constitution, a certain body of law that even the majority cannot vote out or vote against. And and another aspect that then ties into what Adam Curtis speaks about is this addressing this approach of the unconscious or the subconscious, namely this control being something that resonates with the subconscious of people, best understood also in like advertisement that has very suggestive imagery, all these kind of aspects. But focusing on the psyche leads to something where the direct exertion of power is averted and kept in the shadows. It's kept in the background, something that something that kind of generates an illusion or a simulation of a society, something Adam Curtis also speaks about in many of his films, but also other writers like Baudrillard, but specifically also Jacques Ellul, who we will be featuring in the last lecture. He has something that he calls the the world of images, the politics of the world of images. That will be very relevant and ties back into propaganda as well. And yes, so when you do not feel the direct exertion of power, you do not encounter it directly, in a sense, it can maintain a much more deeper seated submission to power. And that is something that will be explored even further in depth when looking at power structures, when looking at society as a system in lecture 4.
Which is on Foucault.
Which is on Foucault and Luhmann.
Yes. So, and for some reason, Foucault triggers a lot of people. You either love him or hate him, apparently. You won't be presenting us with a dogmatic Foucauldian reading, though, will you?
I'm not a dogmatic Foucauldian fanboy.
That means you're not a Foucauldian.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, so the reason why I brought Foucault in is that, in a sense, I was reading Luhmann, Niklas Luhmann, systems theory. I read his general systems theory. I read his theory on the reality of mass media, and his theory on truth and power in the modern state.
Mm-hmm.
And I noticed that from the stuff I remember reading Foucault, that it actually allowed you to actually understand what Foucault is on about in a lot of instances, what he's actually talking about. It actually allows you to unlock Foucault on a better level, at least the interesting and relevant things that he's written. And so I kind of picked up Foucault again and realized how well they kind of integrate into one another and how well you can weave them together. And that is essentially because they both share in common a, you could say, decentral systemic view of society and power. And that means a generally complex network, a complex interwoven web of society, and look at power in terms of specific definitions, how you can understand the causal relationships within that web. Mm-hmm. So that is something that that Luhmann just kind of postulates. And Luhmann is a very systemic thinker, very mathematical thinker, starting from axioms, definitions, first principles, something I'm familiar with. And Foucault isn't really that way as much. He's also more of a historical thinker. But where Luhmann is lacking in explaining the historical relevance and the historical growth of the systemic society, where Luhmann just kind of postulates the systemic society as if it was a given, Foucault kind of brings in that aspect. And where Foucault kind of, doesn't give proper context, or like actually has a real working definition of power that he just never explicitly formulates, Luhmann helps us with that definition, with that specific developed definition of power. And what Foucault speaks of there is so-called governmentality. Governmentality is something he considers has arisen after sovereignty. He claims sovereignty in that sense is dead. There is no such thing as the sovereign, but there is only the scientific management of populations. That is governmentality. It is a universal, you could say, a hybrid of a machine and an ideology, a scientific belief system that basically recycles elites and technocrats that are at most adapted for a particular scientific program of control, of discipline.
Yeah.
And then this ties into his genealogy of this kind of exertion of power, where he focuses on so-called societies of discipline. Famously he's written Discipline and Punish, that no longer exert power through authority. That's where he sees the power of sovereignty rooted in, namely the power of authority, the authority of God, the authority of the king, the people, moving on towards governmentality, moving on towards something that is based on discipline and punish, based on institutionalized reward and punishment mechanisms, so to say. And so the seats of power are no longer the throne, the castle, but they are actually the schools. They're actually the factories. They're actually the prisons. They're actually, right? They're in a sense decentralized. They're everywhere. And power relationships exist everywhere in society. They exist across from people, across from groups of people, within groups, and all over.
Just 1 second. If you're watching this on Twitter, it might be a good idea to come over to YouTube. We will be able to see more of your questions, I think. So if you have questions for Sean, put them in the chat. I think it works on Twitter as well, but I think it works better on YouTube. So let us know if you have any questions for him. I have a question, which is, I think people get tripped up. I mean, with Foucault, because he equates truth with power. But obviously, we would have to understand truth a bit differently here. What does he mean by truth is power?
Right. So, in a sense, you could say, like, the people like Foucault often characterized or categorized in this kind of post-structuralist, post-modernist tradition, meaning the abolition of so-called grand narratives, also inspired, whether correctly or incorrectly, by Nietzsche, among others. The assumption that truth is secondary to power, so to say. Namely, that when there's a particular truth, a particular system of beliefs that people have about reality, about what is not only factually true, but also morally true, or even aesthetically true, that is something that is contingent upon this you could say system of truth being tied to a power mechanism, right? This could reverse and change depending on different power mechanisms throughout history or geographically. So you would have society, in a sense, it's fundamentally, you could say, relativist or morally nihilist. You could say that there is a configuration, a power configuration in a certain society that would be, for example, perfectly fine with human sacrifice. As it is a certain configuration that seems to maintain a societal structure there. And there will be another one that condemns human sacrifice, but these beliefs in the goodness or evil of human sacrifice are something that are contingent upon the power structure within these societies, and they are not something that is decidable or you could say metaphysically, fundamentally wrong or right or true or false beyond the contingent specific contexts of those power relationships. So in that sense, to understand what he means there with the power relationships within society. Sorry, Johannes, did you want to say something else?
No, go on.
Okay. Is that, and that is something that Luhmann brings in to really understand it better, is that power is a medium of social systems. And what does that mean? So a medium, and Luhmann focuses on media a lot, especially mass medium. If people have time, they should also read The Reality of Mass Media. It's not a long book, but it's difficult to read. A medium is basically something like a container that contains various possibilities of conveying information. For example, you have a medium like a newspaper. There are so many trillions of possibilities of what it can contain. So in the same sense, you have in social relationships a medium that contains particular actions, particular actions or causal actors. They don't have to be people, they can be institutions, they can be companies when it comes to economic power, but particular actors that have a variety of actions, a variety of possibilities of actions they can perform. And power is the social medium that contains, so to say, all of these various possibilities. And the capability of an actor resolving this indeterminacy, this indeterminacy of which possibility actualizes. The capability of an actor is that actor's power. It is so broadly defined that it can express itself in various forms and various systems. And so, for example, put it very concretely, if you have one particular person, one actor, that genuinely can resolve the indeterminacy, is there going to be a war or not a war, then you can attribute that power to that person, as that person can resolve the indeterminacy. But what also comes with it, in combination of media as we know it in terms of mass media, is that it has a symbolic function. That in the majority of cases, that decision is not enforced through reward or punishment. Even though one actor has the possibility of rewarding or punishing, it isn't enforced in the majority of cases, but it remains at a symbolic level. So, for example, you see a police station. That police, just the existence, just the presence of that police station carries the symbolic power that already enforces a kind of order without it being directly enforced through reward or punishment by police actions.
But there's a bit more than that. It's not so symbolic, because if you have an utterly corrupt police that on top of it is incapable and not willing or able to enact force, they become the laughing stock. So, I mean, there's a bit more than just simplistic symbolism. So there's actual enactment of hard power, and maybe also respect for the police in a different kind of society, etc., that factors into.
Yeah, definitely. That's a great point, because that's what Luhmann refers to when that's what Luhmann expands upon when he speaks of this symbolic aspect of power, namely the capability that in the act of actualization, that symbolic power can collapse. So that symbolic, there needs to be a particular action. For example, you have what I mentioned earlier, symbolic power of the king. As soon as there is a particular action and it ends up the king just loses half of his privileges to the parliament, then you suddenly have an action happening that collapses the symbolic power. You could almost imagine it as stock prices. You can imagine that there being some concrete company or commodity behind them that is, in a sense, the realization of a particular entity, and the stock price being whatever symbolic power is attributed to it. And that can crash as soon as it has departed too much from its real foundation. And in the same sense, when symbolic power departs too much from its actual foundation and capabilities of enforcing it, then you may witness such a collapse. And the last principle on this part, on lecture 4, is that of identity. So both Luhmann and Foucault focus a lot on identity, and Foucault stresses this double sense of the word subject. You've got the subject as opposed to the object, but you've also got the subject who's subject to power. And that is also where this complex interwoven network plays a role, because the subject for Foucault is not something that exists in isolation, but it is something that defines itself through its web of interrelationships with other entities and with other subjects, with other things, with other beings. And this interrelationship at the same time is an interrelationship of power. This structuring of its interrelationship is at the same time carries the quality of its nature of being a subject in the power structure. And that applies to everyone. That applies to even powerful people. It's not like a one-directional thing. Powerful people, as I said, it's a decentral notion of power that looks at all social relationships. And so you may have a president, king, supreme leader that is still subject to his wife or something like that, right? That's as a example to underline it. And so going on to the last.
1 second, though. We have a question
Oh yeah, sure.
from Nicholas, who is enrolled in the course. Hello, excited for this course. Is Foucault's idea of power related to the idea of magic as a means of framing reality by altering the consciousness of the masses?
That's a great question. I'm not particularly sure if Foucault explicitly would state that, but I would say, just from reading your comment, I would say yes. So I would say definitely, and it really ties into what I mean by the symbolic power. The symbolic power is a kind of nimbus. It is a kind of a magic, you could say a psychic, whatever, libidinal energy, if you want to go with those terminologies, that people are charged with. You can see a real physical reaction in people when they're in the presence of someone powerful.
Mhm.
And that is something that goes way back. That is something that even the Jouvenel begins with in his book, when speaking of the predecessors of sovereignty, the predecessors before even divine sovereignty. You had this kind of animistic, focusing on the studies of Fraser and these people, looking at these animistic power systems where you had a king, but he was even subject to like all of these various chaotic nature forces. You had particular tribes where the king was the most powerful, but because he was so powerful that he could change the weather in their beliefs, he had to sit on his throne in a particular position for like over 100 days in the year, which was really, really tedious. So that some of the kings had to be like captured by their people and like tied to that chair. It's very interesting to look at these kind of things, and how some of them are mirrored again in very modern times where you wouldn't expect it.
Well, on the this ties. I mean, this kind of question, Nicholas, that you should raise also then in the seminars will, of course, that will tie the propaganda seminar and lecture together with power structures, Foucault and Luhmann, and it just so happens that Edward Bernays is the nephew of Sigmund Freud. So one could say, not I, but one could say that propaganda is, I mean, this is a term that Edward Bernays coined, is weaponized psychoanalysis. And now on the symbolic order, etc., and the massive power that Netflix has today, and it's a national or international power because Netflix streams in many countries. Netflix, I think the founder of Netflix is also directly related to Edward Bernays. I think he's another nephew. Um, so there's also an interesting connection
Really,
there,
wow.
even just by family. Yes, yes. Or I think a nephew. And so there are these just family connections, and because you mentioned libidinal energies, etc. That is, of course, what propaganda plays with explicitly, as Bernays says in the book. It is organizing desire, and let's not forget that it is organizing desire also in the direction of "quote unquote" emancipation. The man who sold women cigarettes to liberate themselves, supposedly, was Edward Bernays.
Torches of freedom.
I did not. I wasn't aware of that. Is that in the Adam Curtis documentary
I think that was the name of the
of the cigarette?
campaign, no? Or something like that.
Yeah. I mean, once you, even just that is so worth it. Studying these old ads, because we should open our eyes to advertisement today, and how abundant it is really, uh, and how we are surrounded by it. Before you go to the fifth lecture, here's a question from Susan, which fits in now because it is actually an introductory question to your final lecture,
Perfect.
which is this. Susan asks, will the course explore particular philosophically informed interventions, responses to an increasingly powerful technocratic state system, such as pros and cons of accelerationists, etc.? There's a lot in there, but you can take this as a
Yeah.
springboard into your
That
final
is
part.
the I couldn't wish for a better springboard. So yeah, we're moving on to the last lecture. We're focusing on Jacques Ellul. and Jacques Ellul mainly, especially because, first of all, he's the most in-depth writer on the relationship of power and techniques, and we cannot study power, especially in the modern age, without focusing on technology and the power of techniques. But also, second of all, because he basically ties in together all of the previous lectures. He draws on principles, maybe not explicitly, but principles that are very akin to the ones we study in lecture 1 to 4, and basically brings all these threads together as you could say, a finale of this course. And one of the important principles he speaks of is the notion of politicization or depoliticization. And that is actually very tied to your question, Susan. Namely, he very much focuses, or he was even one of the earliest that was a critic of so-called progressivism, technological progress, in the sense of technological progress. And he called it something as like the autonomy, the necessary sphere of politics that kind of imposes its dominance and authority regardless of the political system. The political system, which he calls the political illusion, is basically an ephemeral theater, an ephemeral spectacle. We have other authors like Baudrillard and Guy Debord who had similar notions of like spectacle or simulacra that is concealing the continuous marching on and growth of technological perfection. And that is something he famously criticized. And one of the aspects he criticized about it is actually politicization. The notion that the expansion of mass media politicizes every aspect of society, makes increasing amount of aspects political and increasing amount of topics that people think about and engage in political, increasing amount of decisions, increasing amount of parts of the daily life political. And he says that actually goes along with a paradoxical reality in which people actually less and less, and the people's opinion less and less matter politically, or actually invoke any political change when it comes to the system. And he advocates for something like I would call it an educated or an enlightened depoliticization. So I need to distinguish it from a depoliticization that is just kind of apathetic, meaning that it's just kind of goes with the masses and just votes whatever everyone else votes and doesn't care. But in a sense, an understanding of how the political system is set up, how it is essentially illusory, and a measured retreat from an engagement and you could say, sacrifice of one's energy and one's good relationships with other peoples in favor of a fake, you could say, political dispute. And that is, I would say, the core and the most important philosophically informed intervention or response that you're asking about, Susan, about this increasingly powerful technocratic state system. And so in that sense, looking at this technocratic and bureaucratic system, that essentially the way he describes it, and he has a whole chapter just on bureaucracy, is pretty much in the way Foucault describes governmentality. So that is pretty much, not sure to what extent he actually relates to Foucault, but like it is a very similar description of this sort of scientific and technological, so science in the sense of technological rationality that guides the management of people via this bureaucracy. So we've kind of tied in the last lecture 4, into this. And at the same time, this politicization aspect, this world of images, the spectacle, is tying into the third lecture, namely propaganda, going back one further to Bernays, looking at what Ellul calls this so-called political world of images. This kind of, you could almost say, slogan-like, flashy, almost tweets, you could call them, or shorts of people just kind of adhering to like, oh yes, I'm for equality. Oh yes, I'm for. They're kind of these like little slogans that just nudge people, but they essentially are politically meaningless in terms of actual management of some kind of central state authority or some central state mechanism. And actually, if you look at it, even figures that seem slightly political, seem like they are genuinely political, they're actually seen increasingly with suspicion. Like people almost, the system almost doesn't want too much stirring up the pot, so to say, right? And going on, tying it into the second lecture on sovereignty, we can see Ellul's polarity of the necessary and the ephemeral, and that is exactly the Jouvenel's mysterious continued essence of power that continues across this kind of interplay between the friend and enemy, the friend ruling over the enemy and destroying the enemy. Across this interplay, this continued essence is mirrored in the polarity between the ephemeral, the changing faces and outer appearances of power, and the necessary, the core of the technological continuous expansion that progresses throughout various outside appearances that power may take on in an ephemeral way. And finally, tying it back to the very beginning, to Plato and Aristotle, we have the title of the book itself, namely The Political Illusion. The entire process, the entire project that Ellul is engaged in is breaking through the veil, escaping the cave of images, of shadows, getting out of the illusion that the political system has put us in, and understanding power and looking at it for what it really is, tying it back to one of the oldest principles, essentially, of philosophy, namely the allegory of the cave.
So, does Ellul see a way out? Guy Debord, for example, thought that Socratic education could end the spectacle. There's an interesting anecdote, shall we say, from the late 1990s in Italy, when Silvio Berlusconi's media empire, which was very powerful in Italy for quite some time, I have no idea where it's now, given that he died. And the CEO, who was not Berlusconi at the time, was asked in an interview how they had gotten so powerful in Italy with the radio stations and TV stations and newspapers, etc. And the response was, well, I read Guy Debord. So I read about the spectacle, and we applied the principles of the spectacle. And thereby he also, whether knowingly or not, he disproved Guy Debord, who thought that educating the people about the spectacle would dethrone or limit the power or the reach of the spectacle. So what is Ellul's suggestion?
That is interesting. It reminds me as well. I didn't know about this with Guy Debord. It's very interesting. It reminds me as well of the I think one of the founders of BuzzFeed. Are you familiar with BuzzFeed? He famously read Gilles Deleuze and Guattari, and got inspired by this kind of
obviously
reterritorialization, deterritorialization of identities, and that's how it's built into a lot of BuzzFeed's thing. What type of this and that are you? What type of this and that? Kind of astrology for the internet. Anyways, back to Ellul. So he in the political illusion, he focuses specifically on this aspect of depoliticization. He doesn't expand on it much deeper than that. I know that he was a kind of Christian anarchist in a sense. So generally, I would say that his advocacy would go towards retreating from large centralized technologized power systems at all. and redirecting it towards more communal structures, more communal societies, united in a kind of communal religious practice that is not centralized by some sort of central church or something like that. I would suspect that that's the direction he would point us towards in that context.
I don't know where this comes from, but I met I had a conversation with someone in Palermo last 2 years ago who said, and I've heard this many times from other people, but so it must be coming from somewhere. Maybe it even comes from Foucault or someone like this. That the Catholic Church is the oldest media empire in the world. And you look at the
I was gonna say that earlier when you said that Bernays coined the term propaganda. As far as I know, it's definitely true that he massively popularized it. Like it was
yeah,
virtually
powerful.
unknown before, but it
Yeah,
was the instance it was used in. I think was in the context of Catholic missionary work. So that would be an interesting
propagate. Yeah.
interesting anecdote to what you just said.
But it's always important, that's what I said during a first live stream. There's a difference with you propagate faith in God, family, and religion, or the usage of cigarettes, alcohol, and bacon for the sake of profit generation. I'd say there's a pretty stark difference.
Yeah,
Uh,
yeah, for
so,
sure. But I would say where the comparison applies is when that propagation is used for specifically political purposes, for example. Right. When it comes to,
well,
for example,
yeah,
getting
okay,
what's it called,
but
absolution letters. What's it called, revenue through 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 means of absolving people of sins, or getting or mobilizing for particular political projects like crusades and wars. Maybe there you could find a particular validity of that comparison.
yeah, but even advertisement for cigarettes are political. They're not independent of politics, especially because increasing the workforce by making women work, that lets the capitalist state reduce pay. So there's always a political dimension to all of this, as you said yourself, that it is mass society is always politicized, so it's not free from it, not at all. Self-determination, etc. These are all political concepts. Um, okay, let's see if there are. So let us know if you have more questions, Sean. What else would you like to impart to the people so that they may join us?
I don't have much more to say except that I'm looking forward to seeing you in the seminars on Sunday. I'm looking forward to hearing all of the thinkers you bring to the table, hearing your arguments, hearing your dialogues, your debates with each other. I think this will be an amazing learning experience for all of us, including myself. And I really don't think power is explored in this kind of depth in anywhere else. I think this is something where we all can benefit a lot from, and yeah, I'm really looking forward to this. It's every time it's a pleasure teaching at Halkyan Guild, teaching about topics that interest me, that interest other people. So I'm looking forward to this.
Thank you very much. We look forward to let's just see if, by the way, the indulgence trade I mentioned Jakob Fugger last time.
Yeah.
Fugger, this banker from Augsburg, he was involved with it and very greedy, and the greed got so big that obviously people got a bit angry with the church. So the response was to build St. Peter's to make up for it again. So that's where the money was used in part. But the involvement by, and this helped apparently Martin Luther and
Okay.
his preachings, because he had not been very popular, but the indulgence trade helped him gain popularity, at least the excesses of that. So another question that is often raised, which you could respond to, is there any prerequisite for the course? And I'll just show you all again the enrollment page. Is there any prerequisite for the course?
Well, the main prerequisite is having an interest in the topic of power, I would say. I mean, there's the stuff we're going to discuss is what we'll all be reading, what we'll all manage to read between each sessions. And yeah, if you have the interest and the motivation to engage with those topics and read them, that is the main prerequisites to join us.
Okay, so let me just summarize then what you can do this Sunday. So in 5 days at 6 p.m. UK time, that's 1 p.m. Eastern Standard Time. For those of you who are in North America and anywhere else in the world, you can figure out your own time zone. We'll begin. We're meeting 6 times in total. So 5 lectures, 5 seminars. They're all listed on the enrollment page that you can see here. The link to enroll is in the description of this video. If you're watching this on YouTube, it's also on my timeline on Twitter. If you're watching this on Twitter, we have right now almost 130 people on Twitter watching this. So if you are on Twitter, go to my timeline, click on the link that takes you to the Teachable website, and then enroll from there. If you have any questions afterwards, just leave a comment and I'll try and get to you as quickly as I can. Sean teaches this course. I'm hosting the course, so I'll be there in the background. If you have time for the seminars, let's say at least 3 of them, then you should join the Philosophical Fellowship, which is this one. Click here, you click on enroll now, etc. You could also, if you don't have time, choose asynchronous study, 5 lectures, lifetime access or indefinite access. Or this one here, philosophical dialogue, 6 private tutorials with Sean. Sean, maybe a couple of words on what it is that goes on in those.
Yeah, so depending on what your intention is with these, this is an intensive session to explore some topics deeper, potentially other authors as well, potentially stuff you're working on, projects you're working on. I've had great experiences doing that in the last course. We had someone that was focusing on expanding his knowledge on the general topic of that philosophical aspect of technology at the time. This time it'll be on power, but it can also be on other topics outside of the scope that go beyond. If you're interested in expanding your knowledge or increasing your proficiency in arguing and in presenting and speaking about these topics and writing about these topics, that this would be the perfect option for you.
Yeah, exactly. So, if you've already putting out, let's say, your own stuff, videos, or writing on a Substack, etc. Maybe you're in business. I think one of the gentlemen from last time, he was a successful business man who I think you're still in touch with, or at least have been for quite some time afterwards. So this could turn into a longer form of consultation. Or, of course, you could use this if you want to focus specifically more just on Plato or on Aristotle or Jacques Ellul. You could just spend these 6 sessions reading only Jacques Ellul and maybe touch on the other thinkers as well, but you could go line by line almost, as if you had as if with a private teacher, which is basically what this is. So this could go in any direction: private consultation, also private teaching, etc. But especially, of course, the academic side is what we make very strong. You could also choose 2 payments for the philosophical fellowship, which would be this one here. So we would like to invite you again, most cordially, to join the course, The Dynamics of Power, the Philosophy of Power, from the Greek polis to the techno-economic complex web in which we all have to live somehow. If not dwell, then at least survive. So thank you again very much, Sean, for your lecture here. I think even if people are not enrolling, they've learned a lot already and have found many thinkers that maybe they haven't heard of before. And so you could read this on your own time. For anyone else who's open and willing to join us, we look forward to meeting you on Sunday. Thank you very much.
Thank you.